Sharon, you're muted.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Sharon North, the Public Information Officer for the Department of Public Works and Environmental Services. This is the first of two meetings to update you on the Lake Accotink dredging project. The second meeting, which is in person, takes place tomorrow at 7 p.m. in the cafeteria at Kings Glen Elementary School at 5401 Danbury Forest Drive in Springfield. Before we get started, there's some housekeeping to take care of. Be advised, this is a virtual meeting. It will be recorded, captured via transcript and video. This meeting is conducted electronically through dedicated video and audio conferencing using Zoom. The recording of the meeting will be available online in the next few days. This is a 2-hour meeting. It will end promptly at 9 p.m. There are elected officials on the meeting. However, there will be no votes, no final decisions, and no official actions taken. At this time, I would like to recognize Chairman Jeffrey McKay and Supervisor James Walkinshaw. Following the presentations, there will be an opportunity for public comments and questions. Again, elected and/or appointed officials on this meeting will be listening, but will not make any decisions or take official actions. We ask that you remain respectful and courteous during the public comments period. We also ask that you remain on topic. To ensure that as many people as possible have an opportunity to ask questions or make comments, we will limit each speaker to 3 minutes. We will give you a 30-second warning when you are nearing your time limit. Since the meeting is being recorded, staff will respond to questions, but not comments. We will read and respond to questions in the chat, again, not the comments. We will save the chat from the meeting so you can review it later. We want to receive your input so the Board of Supervisors can take your feedback into account and consideration when they decide how to proceed. And here are 3 ways to provide your comments and your questions. Type your questions or comments into the chat on the side of your screen. If you don't see it, please refresh your web page. You can also call in to share input or ask a question over the telephone. Call the number located right above this video. It's 855-925-2801 and enter the code 8809. Once you dial in, the recorded message will direct you to press star for more options. To join the speaker queue, press option 3. You'll still be able to hear the meeting, but if you're listening online, there is a slight delay, so it may be challenging to hear both. When it's your turn to speak, a pre-recorded voice will prompt you to begin. Please state your name for the record and whether you're calling for yourself or an organization. You will be given 3 minutes to ask questions or make a comment. Staff will respond only to the question, not the comment, before moving to the next person. We will give you the 30-second warning when you're nearing your time limit. Again, since the meeting is being recorded, staff will respond to questions, not comments, and we will read and respond to questions in the chat, not comments. However, we will save the chat from the meeting. For those wanting to email comments or questions, the email address is the letter F as in Frank, 515@publicinput.com. That's F515@publicinput.com. The public comment period will remain open until April 1st, 2023. We will get started now by asking if any of the elected officials would like to speak at this time. Does Chairman McKay have anything that he would like to say?
Very briefly, Sharon, thank you for all that information. And I want to thank the folks who have joined us both tonight and the folks who will join us at the in-person meeting tomorrow. I think it's fair to say we're very disappointed. We've been working on this project for a long time, a lot of years, and certainly the circumstances that have very recently been reported to the board and to the community, of course, are dramatically different than where we were at the beginning of this process. And as someone who's been in the county for a long time, I can say without hesitation that is highly unusual. Typically, we're right on the mark. And in this particular case, circumstances, pricing, other things have changed dramatically. And I think many people have seen that in the press and have heard that through other means. And so the purpose of tonight's meeting is to make sure that we can get a full staff presentation and to get feedback from people, as you mentioned, not only tonight in our two meetings, but also in an extended comment period that we'll be allowing as well, because this certainly is an important issue for everyone around the lake, but really for everyone in the county. This is a treasure, and we need to, have as much information as possible to make the right decisions. But it is disappointing where we find ourselves today, but we need to make sure that the public understands where we are. Lastly, Supervisor Walkinshaw and I were, very recently briefed on the latest, and so this news came as a shock, I know, to both of us. Will come as a shock to the community, and we're just going to have to work our way through this with a whole lot of public input. I still have a lot of questions that I want to ask, and I know our residents will too, and that's the beauty of this platform. And so thank you all for joining us, and look forward to people's comments.
Thank you. Does Supervisor Walkinshaw want to say anything at this point?
Yes, thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Chairman McKay, for those words. I want to just start by acknowledging that there are folks on this meeting tonight who are angry about what they've heard, and I'm angry too. Like many of you, I love Lake Accotink and Lake Accotink Park. It's my favorite place in Fairfax County, and I know that folks in the community have stories about what the lake and the park means to you and to your families, and some of those stories go back generations to your parents or your grandparents taking you to Lake Accotink. And the news that I shared last week is not the news, as Chairman McKay said, the news that any of us wanted to hear. And I know that you all have a lot of questions. How could a project that we were told would cost $30 million now cost $395 million over 25 years? What'll be the timeline and the process for the Board of Supervisors to make a decision on this? Will that process be rushed, and will the community have a voice? The answers are no and yes. And what will happen to the lake and the park if the lake isn't dredged? One thing that I think is important, I want to just reiterate that what I shared last week and what you've seen is a staff recommendation. And this isn't a decision that we would make without providing you and the community the opportunity to ask questions, share feedback, and weigh in. But we can't sugarcoat it. The prognosis for this project is not good right now. That's just the reality. And I desperately wish that the reality was different, but it isn't. I also know that there's hard feelings in the community about how the county and especially county staff handled this issue in 2018 before the beginning of the Save Lake Accotink movement. I know I was there with you, and I understand that it's going to take some time to restore that trust. But the amount of sediment that's in the lake right now, and the amount of sediment that's flowing into the lake, and the costs to dredge and dispose of that sediment are unfortunately not a matter of opinion. And the costs are the costs, and we have to be honest about that with each other. I want to just share, and this will be reiterated later, the next steps in the process that'll take place after this week's meetings. I will have a public comment period for anyone in the community to submit their questions, their comments, and their feedback through April 1st. County staff will also prepare a detailed, frequently asked questions page responding to the most common questions that we get from you in the community. And after that public comment period, I've asked that the Board of Supervisors receive a full briefing in the spring. And that presentation will include the results of the public comment period, your feedback, the most up-to-date analysis and cost estimates, and the various options and how those options would need to be paid for, including the option to move forward with dredging. I represent Lake Accotink and the neighborhoods and communities surrounding it. I'm going to work to make sure that your voices are part of this process and that the board hears how important the lake is to us. But as I said before, we're facing difficult realities, and I feel I have a responsibility to be honest with you all about that. And before I wrap it up and get to the presentation and your questions and comments, I just want to note, there's a lot of rumors flying around on social media. I want to address one of them, the rumor that Lake Accotink has been or would be sold by Fairfax County to a developer. I know there's folks in the community that have been saying that, and I can reassure you that is not going to happen. We don't sell parkland to developers in Fairfax County. And if someone tried to do it to Lake Accotink Park, I'd be arrested because I'd be tied to a tree out there. It's not going to happen. But we do have a difficult dialogue and conversation to have here as a community about the realities of the situation. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And Sharon, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Also want to recognize Supervisor Penny Gross has joined the meeting at this point. We'll now hear from Chris Harrington, Director of the Department of Public Works and Environmental Services.
Thank you and good evening. I am the Director of Fairfax County's Department of Public Works and Environmental Services, and part of my job as Director of Public Works includes responsibility for managing stormwater for all of Fairfax County's 1.17 million residents, and my department is responsible for managing this dredging project. As you've heard, the purpose of tonight's meeting is for county staff and our expert consultant team to provide you, the community, an update on the Lake Accotink dredging project and to start to receive your feedback on the county's staff recommendation. We have reached a decision point in this project, but I want to reiterate again that no decision by the Board of Supervisors on what happens next has been made yet, just as you heard from the Chairman and Supervisor Walkinshaw. No decision will be made tonight. I am not the one making the decision for the county. We, county staff and our consultants, have done our rigorous engineering analysis. I have reviewed that analysis and I'm ready to make my recommendation to you, the community, and to the Board of Supervisors. As director responsible for the county stormwater management, it is my job to review the facts, to understand the Board of Supervisors policy directives, and to make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors, who again will be making the final decision. Before I share that recommendation, I'd like to take us back in time just a little bit. I was appointed director in July of 2021, and even before I arrived in Fairfax County, I had heard about Lake Accotink. One of my very first field trips was to Lake Accotink, and my wife and I first visited there in the few days after we had moved here from Texas and before I started this position. I've heard many, many stories from our own employees here in Public Works about the deep connection they and their families have to Lake Accotink and the park. I know that county staff and our consultant team have worked many hours on this project. They've done an excellent job, and I am very proud of their work today. I can easily imagine the countless hours that many of you in our community have personally invested in working to maintain the lake as we want it to be. I'm proud to live in a community with engaged residents like you. I say this because I do not make the recommendation that you will hear from me tonight lightly. I know it will be extremely disappointing to many of you. It brings me no joy to say this, but I cannot recommend, as the county staff, as the Director of Public Works, my staff recommendation is that we cannot proceed with dredging, the full lake dredging of Lake Accotink. How did I arrive at that recommendation? Part of my job is to implement policy promulgated by the board. The Board of Supervisors has adopted our Community Energy and Climate Action Plan that, among other things, calls for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and an increase in our urban tree canopy coverage. The board has adopted Resilient Fairfax, which, among many other things, directs us to sustainably manage our natural resources. The board has also adopted the County Executive's Strategic Plan, which, among many other things, directs us to prioritize effective and efficient government, safety, and the environment. It's for these reasons that I cannot recommend that we dredge Lake Accotink. To fund the nearly $400 million cost to dredge and maintain the lake, the Board of Supervisors would have to raise taxes for all county residents. That is money that will not be available to reduce flood risk for the thousands of residents whose homes are already flooding today. That is money that will not be available for stream restoration projects or to build any other important project that the county would otherwise fund. To fully dredge Lake Accotink, as you'll hear tonight, we will have to permanently deforest a substantial amount of county parkland. To fully dredge Lake Accotink, we'll have to put 50,000 greenhouse gas emitting trucks on our roads to haul away that sediment. And we'll have to do major maintenance dredging every 5 years that will be disruptive to the community. Dredging Lake Accotink, in my opinion, is not sustainable. It does not make Fairfax County more resilient. It does not make Fairfax County safer. And in my opinion, it is not efficient and effective government. Again, remember, that is my opinion based on my review of what is an intensive engineering analysis done by our expert staff and consultants. That is not the county's decision because the Board of Supervisors has not yet made their decision. As you heard from Chairman McKay and Supervisor Walkinshaw, they are disappointed in how we got here because of the change in projected costs. Many of you are likely confused and frustrated as well that the initial cost estimate moved from about $330 million to now nearly $400 million. I understand that. That is frustrating. It is important to remember that the initial analysis was just that, an initial preliminary analysis based on a set of certain assumptions. Some of those assumptions, critical ones, have now changed. Those early costs did not include any maintenance dredging, which we now know to be absolutely essential to maintain the lake over time and at a major cost. Those early costs underestimated the amount of sediment, and we now know that we have 43% more sediment to dredge. Those early cost estimates assumed a best case scenario that we would have free or low cost disposal options, which is now no longer an option. Ultimately, though, I believe county staff did not accurately convey to the Board of Supervisors and to you, the community, our level of confidence in that initial estimate and appropriately convey the caveats associated with that. For that, I apologize. I apologize to the community and I apologize to the board. However, now we have done a much more complete and rigorous analysis based on the real world constraints that we have today. And this is where we are, and that's what we're here to communicate to you. Some of you have expressed concerns about what happens to the water quality of the creek and the bay if we do not dredge. Specifically, I know some of you are concerned that by dredging, we'll have to do a lot more to meet our obligations to the state, our total maximum daily load allocation, to address existing impairments in the watershed. Know that my department is both a regulator, we issue permits, and we are regulated. We manage the county stormwater discharge permit issued by the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, and we take regulatory compliance very seriously. I'm telling you, there is no significant additional regulatory burden on the county if we do not dredge Lake Accotink. Let me say that again. We will not be significantly penalized if we do not dredge the lake. The Department of Environmental Quality cannot compel us to dredge the lake. Even if we did proceed with dredging the lake as initially envisioned, the county would still be obligated to do stream restoration in the 60+ stream miles upstream of the lake. Regardless of whether dredging proceeds or not, we are still going to restore streams in the watershed to meet our regulatory obligations. Any additional stream restoration that we may be obligated to do, if we ultimately choose not to dredge, would still be 20 times or more less expensive than dredging, much less impactful to the county as a whole, and a much more sustainable approach. Tonight, we're also going to hear about an offline lake option. And some of you may be wondering why you're just now hearing this. When it became increasingly apparent as our analysis proceeded, that the impacts from the full lake dredge were going to be much larger than we had initially communicated to the board and to the community, I directed our consultant team to evaluate the feasibility of an offline lake to maintain a more permanent pool of water to determine if we could at least partly satisfy the community's expectations. Unfortunately, as you will hear tonight, I do not believe that the cost associated with the offline lake option, especially given the very high level of uncertainty that it would be a permanent solution, means that I also cannot recommend we proceed with that option either. So what am I recommending? I am recommending that we return to where we started in this journey. I recommend we resume the master planning process with the community to determine a new community vision for the future. Again, that is my staff recommendation as the Director of Public Works to the board. Lastly, all of this information may come as a shock to you, and you may be wondering why you haven't heard about some of these developments sooner. That's because this is just the beginning of the community input process for this phase of the project. We've developed a robust story map, an interactive website that's online now with all of the facts and a description of how we got here. If you haven't visited yet, please, I encourage you to do so. It will be where we're communicating additional information and receiving feedback from you that begins tonight. Again, the purpose of tonight's meeting is for my team to share the facts from our engineering analysis, for me to share my recommendation based on those facts, which I have now done, and for the community to begin to share your opinions and values with the Board of Supervisors who are here today, as you have heard, and who will decide ultimately how we proceed. Now, I've talked long enough, so let's please get started. So Sharon, I pass the microphone back to you, and I thank everyone very much for attending tonight.
Thank you so much, Chris. Now we have some presentations that we would like to share with you. We'll begin with Charles Smith, the project manager and a branch chief in the DPW ES Stormwater Planning Division. Charles.
Great. Can you all see the full screen version of this presentation? Excellent. Thank you
Yes.
very much. Again, welcome this evening. Our job this evening is to report out on our findings from the analysis of both the dredging option and the small Alpine Lake option. So I'm leading off, and then I'll turn it over to our consultant, Accotink, who has done an excellent job of looking at all the alternatives and provide some very detailed analysis outputs for you. So just as a reminder, we've gone through our agenda, the upper portion here, greeting orientation, elected officials who are present, Chris's comments, and then now we'll do the presentations, and we will be followed by questions and answer period. So we will have plenty of time to get through most of those questions. As Chris mentioned, we intend to end on time tonight at 9 p.m. But we will be meeting again, of course, tomorrow and having an ongoing dialogue with the community. The purpose is really to update you all. This is, obviously we work for you. We are employees of the county. Our job is to try to implement projects, but we're here to report out on what we found based on the analysis that was conducted on both the dredging, potential dredging project and the smaller offline lake option, and also get feedback from you all. And we've gone through a pretty extensive process. As many of you know, we started this project about 3 years ago, and we reported out multiple times, most recently about a year ago. And so at this point, we again are here only to present our recommendations and findings, and then we will proceed with the public process from there to get to an ultimate decision about what to do about the next steps for the lake. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Amanda Kohler from Accotink, and let Amanda walk you through the technical analysis.
All right. Thank you, Charles. Can you confirm that you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So as Charles mentioned, my name is Amanda Kohler. I'm with Accotink, environmental engineer that helped lead the dredging program analysis. So I am here today to present sort of a summary of the technical analysis that we did perform. All right. So as a reminder for folks, the dredge program objectives that we had for doing our analysis was to take the Lake Accotink from its current depth of 1 to 4 feet, increase it to 8 feet within its existing footprint, retain and enhance the open water aesthetic and recreational value of the lake, as well as establish a maintenance dredging plan to preserve the lake as a valuable community asset in the long term. Some things that I do want to point out about Lake Accotink is its current lake area is 55 acres, and the average sedimentation rate within the lake is about 19,000 cubic yards per year on average. So as part of the dredging program, what we were looking at and what we're doing our alternatives analysis for was sort of a whole system approach. The first thing that we were looking at was to identify a dewatering site and identify the preparations that would need to be done to support both the first base dredging as well as future maintenance dredging events. The next step of the project is to perform the dredging itself. The third step is the dewatering of the sediment to reduce the overall volume that requires offsite transportation disposal, which is step 4. For the base dredging program, this would include a one-time 500,000 cubic yard removal that would occur over approximate 3-year duration. And then again, one of the main components that was looked at was also the maintenance dredging. Maintenance dredging is assumed to be about 150,000 cubic yard removal over a 5-year period, or on 5 years, every 5 years on average. So again, one of the main considerations that we had and that we had presented previously was trying to identify a dewatering site location for processing of the dredge material. There were numerous sites that were evaluated. Those that passed the initial screening included the 9 locations that you see on the screen. And for each of those locations, we did a detailed analysis to try and identify a dewatering location that optimized the balance between various community impacts, environmental impacts, as well as financial impacts. At the end of the analysis, 2 locations remained as technically viable options: the Wakefield Park Maintenance Facility and the Southern Drive site. So I'll now step through and talk about what the dredging program would look at each of those 2 sites. For the Wakefield Maintenance Facility, site preparations would include clearing of approximately 7 acres of wetlands, or of forested areas, and constructing of a dewatering pad. There's also construction of a new site entrance to keep truck traffic or associated with the project off of the Wakefield Park Road. There's also construction of a permanent pipeline connecting the lake to the dewatering site. Once that site is prepared, dredging would begin, including the removal of the 500,000 cubic yards of sediment from the lake. That material would be transported up to the dewatering site via that underground pipeline. Concurrent with the dredging, as the sediment arrives at the dewatering site, it would be dewatered. The separated water would be treated and returned to the system. And then once the material is sufficiently dewatered, trucks that are coming off of I-495 would enter through that newly constructed Braddock Road entrance, be loaded, and then again, to avoid impacts to the Wakefield Road, trucks would turn right out of the new site entrance, continue on Braddock Road to I-66 via 123. The table on the lower left does present the estimated daily traffic, truck traffic associated with the project, as well as the comparison to VDOT data from 2019. So just as a rough estimate, that each day, 95 trucks would be loaded with dewatered sediment. So that would be 95 trucks heading into the site and then out of the site along Braddock Road. Now switching over to the Southern Drive site, it would follow a similar process. It would include the clearing and construction of a dewatering area on the site, construction of that permanent underground pipeline connecting the lake to the dewatering site, and all of this would occur before the initial base dredge. Once the site is prepared and ready to go, dredging would commence, again with that 500,000 cubic yards, and that material being transported via the underground pipeline to the dewatering site, where the material would then be dewatered. Any of the water generated would be treated and then returned back to the system. For this location, again, we looked at what the potential disposal routes would be, and it's what we are shown here. So again, the trucks would be coming off of I-95, would travel down along Edsel Road, down Backlick, and then along Highland Street to Accotink Road and Southern Drive. As you'll notice in the table, we do show that the one-way truck trips along that Highland Street to Accotink Park Road is 190 trucks per day. And that's for each incoming truck is going to have to exit via that pathway. So that is the sort of the overview of the Southern Drive option. And so one of the things that we did talk about and has been mentioned is that the base dredging event, the total price for that increased from what was originally assumed to be 30 million in the previous phase of the project, that we're now, our understanding is about 95 million. And you can see the breakdown of that for the various steps here on this slide. In addition, for this estimate, we also did an estimate for the maintenance dredging. And those values had not previously been calculated, but based on that 5-year average dredging cycle, the total maintenance dredging costs over the first 20 years would be around $300 million. So I know there's a lot of question of what has impacted the costs. So the many factors did impact from what was originally discussed in 2018 to now. One of the main things, especially for the base dredging event, is that the volume of sediment that was assumed to require removal increased from 350,000 cubic yards to 500,000 cubic yards. So it's a 43% increase in that base dredging event. In addition, there's a number of inflation and supply chain impacts that have occurred, specifically since the start of COVID, as I'm sure many folks are aware of. Additionally, one of the assumptions in the original proposal is that there would be a significant quantity of material that would be able to be reused or placed on site for that base dredging event. Based on analysis that was performed and field investigations performed as part of this project, it was determined that based on the physical properties of the sediment, its ability to be reused, or its physical properties are not conducive for reuse. So it's now assumed that most of that material would require offsite disposal. And that includes material from future maintenance dredging would also require that offsite disposal component. And sort of going into that larger quantity, the inability to reuse some of the material, as well as the production rates, a larger than expected dewatering site, it was found to be required. So when we take all of that into consideration, we did try and find as many different options for site processing. However, there were numerous land use conflicts. Previous assumed available options were determined to no longer be available or viable. So we had a decrease in the number of locations that were available. So as was mentioned, based on the results of this analysis, the county did ask us to take another look at the offline lake option that had been discussed in prior to 2018. So just to give an overview of what that is, again, I'll first start out with where we are existing currently. For this, again, I want to point out the current footprint of the lake is about 55 acres. So the new offline lake, the objective of that would be to create a smaller offline lake, create a new dam to create a channelized section of Accotink Creek through the lake. And then that offline lake would be about 28 acres in size. So you're reducing that a little under half. It would still have that 8-foot depth associated with it. So in order to create this offline lake, what would need to happen is you would need to dredge both that 500,000 cubic yards that we were talking about, the full dredge program, as well as an additional 325,000 cubic yards would need to be removed within the footprint of where that new dam and channelized Accotink Creek would be constructed. And that additional dredging is needed to get down to a suitable subgrade to be able to construct those new features. So as part of that, for construction of the dam, so in addition to removing material, you would have to import about 340,000 cubic yards of fill to construct that new earthen dam. Also as part of this work, a portion of the existing dam would be removed to allow for the channelized flow from the newly constructed Accotink Creek to continue downstream. The new creek would have to be constructed with both bank stability and energy dissipation in mind. So this next slide gives the overview of what the current estimated, based on our current understanding, the opinion of probable costs. Again, we see a lot of the similar types of costs or similar categories of costs of the full dredge program, with the addition of the new dam and stream channel construction, as well as the cost for modifying the existing dam. So the total cost for this is about $192 million. This would be just that one-time cost, but there would not be assumed any maintenance dredging required to maintain that smaller offline lake scenario. So as I've mentioned in the previous slide, and as you can tell by the cost estimates for this, there is that significant increase in both the offsite disposal as well as the required material importing to the site. So one of the things that we did want to take another look at is the potential transportation routes. So on this slide, we're showing, again, you will notice a similar route from the Wakefield Maintenance Facility. And that route is showing the offsite disposal of the dewatered sediment leaving the site. There's also a potential for a portion of the material to be reused as part of the berm as well. So you'll notice those routes in both blue along Hemming Avenue and green along Backlick Road. And that would be taking material either from the Wakefield Maintenance Facility or incoming trucks from I-495 to import material to the lake itself for that berm construction. So again, we've shown sort of the estimated truck trips as well as the current truck information for those various routes. So in addition, I do want to point out that there are potential fill staging areas that would occupy the marina area of Lake Accotink, as well as the parking lot, and that those areas would be needed to stage that imported fill for the construction of that new berm. The next slide that we're showing is just the use of that Southern Drive site specifically for both the material processing as well as the staging for the potential berm fill material. So that sort of concludes the extent of the evaluation that was performed, and I'll now turn it back over to Charles.
Thank you, Amanda. All right, can you see my full screen? Great.
Yes.
All right. So I just want to conclude with a reiteration of the staff recommendations that based on the analysis that has been completed, that we do not recommend going ahead with a dredge of Lake Accotink, either as the base dredge or the maintenance dredging. And simply, we do not feel it's sustainable over time. It has a very high both fiscal, environmental, and social costs associated with it. And in addition, we do not recommend going forward with a smaller offline lake. And the reasons for that are that it's technically feasible. It is something we consider to have a very high risk factor to it from a safety perspective as well as long-term sustainability. It's also a very costly project and it causes a lot of also environmental and social impacts in the construction. So we also recognize again that this is our staff recommendation. We are not making any final decisions. We are recommending to the Board of Supervisors what we feel should not be gone forward with. However, we also understand it'll be a public process and a follow-on for decision making. At this time, as staff, what we want to do is we want to turn this over to you all for comment. We go ahead and we'll have the question comment period. And in addition, we want to really promote the fact that it does not end tonight, that we will be receiving public comments through April 1st, and that we can take those to multiple venues. We will capture comments tonight. We'll capture both the questions tonight and post those back on the webpage. And in addition, you all will be posting a survey you can take starting Friday. And you also can put your comments into the comment section, both in the story map and on the project webpage, which can be found here. You get additional information. So Sharon, I'll turn it back over to you. And I think we can move over to the chat and start taking some questions, or do you want to go ahead and have some public speakers?
We're going to recap, for people who may have come on a little late, how they can participate in the comments. Type your questions or comments into the chat on the side of your screen. If you can't see it, refresh your webpage. You can also call in using the number that's on the screen. It's 855-925-2801. You can enter the code 8809. When you hear the recorded message, press star for more options. If you want to speak, press 3 to get into the queue. You can still hear the meeting, though there may be an audio delay. When it is your turn to speak, a pre-recorded voice will prompt you to begin. Say your name for the record and identify whether you're calling for yourself or representing an organization. All speakers will have only 3 minutes to share their comments or ask their questions. We will give you a 30-second warning when you're nearing your time limit. We will only respond to questions this evening, not comments. For those who want to email their comments or questions, the email address is f515@publicinput.com. That's F as in Frank, 515@publicinput.com. And as Charles said, the public comment period will remain open until April 1st. We're going to start with the chat and then kind of alternate between the chat and phone calls.
I'll take a few things off the chat quickly. The original purpose of the lake was as a drinking water reservoir for what was then Camp Humphreys, became Fort Belvoir. That was there were 2 different iterations of the dam. The current one was built in 1943. There's a question about whether or not it will become just part of Accotink Stream Valley. Lake Accotink Park will remain Lake Accotink Park. We would defer to our Park Authority colleagues to help guide that conversation. But I believe that the intent is to resume the master planning process as soon as a decision is made about what our next steps are, and let the public weigh in on how we envision this site, but certainly remain a special site with many resources and opportunities for the public over time. The issue about velocity and treating stormwater. So we are working diligently within the Accotink watershed. We've implemented a tremendous number of projects through Public Works, and we are continuing to do so in partnership with the Park Authority and many other landowners and communities. So I think the answer is that we are working diligently to reduce velocities where we can. we control very little of the uplands. So this watershed was developed before many of the modern stormwater controls were required. So we are dealing with what comes to us. So many of our projects are focused on stream restoration and dealing with what happens once the water gets in the stream valleys. But we do work whenever possible with retrofitting stormwater facilities and with working with public landowners and in the redevelopment process as properties become, whether it's a commercial property or otherwise, they'll also have to implement stormwater improvements over time, but it will take many years. So the answer is that we are working to do so, but it's a slow slog to reduce velocities within the stream. So mostly we're dealing with trying to reduce the sediment load, which is a critical factor within our required permitting for Fairfax County. There are questions about measurements being taken to reduce sediment washing downstream. The sediment flows within the Accotink Creek watershed were determined using the gauge stations that are present. That process is ongoing through the U.S. Geological Survey, and Fairfax County is partnering closely with them to continue extensive monitoring within the watershed. So monitoring of the sediment loads as well as what's happening over time is ongoing. There's a question about whether or not we can expect Lake Accotink to become like Huntley Meadows. I think the answer is that we don't know. If the lake were not dredged, we do not know the time frame in which it would change and exactly how it would change. I think our expectation is in the near term, it would remain unchanged. You would see an open water feature. Slowly over time, we'd expect that wetlands would begin to develop along the margins in the upper end of the lake as more sediment comes in and vegetation becomes established. So the bottom line is that we do anticipate there being an increase in wetlands. And there was a question later on in the chat about habitat. If Lake Accotink were to secede to a wetland, more of a wetland feature, it actually would improve the habitat. You would have much greater wildlife diversity and abundance, because currently the fishery that's there is very poor. And the open water habitat is actually relatively devoid of life when it comes to fish and other organisms. It's as we increase wetland footprint, it would increase dramatically the amount of wildlife habitat around the margin. So I think over time you would see greater diversity and abundance of wildlife. There's a question about fines being levied by the EPA. So as Chris mentioned in his comments, we would not be fined. Fairfax County would not be compelled to manage Lake Accotink. And we do not anticipate significant increases in our requirements under our county permit. We have talked preliminarily with the Department of Environmental Quality, who's our regulator, and we feel we're going to have a good understanding with them. We do anticipate there would be, if we did not dredge, there may be an increase in a portion of our required load reduction for Accotink Creek, but it would not be that very significant. There's also questions about impacts on Chesapeake Bay. I can state that empirically, the vast majority of sediment washing through the system is captured in the system. There has been one of the longest running studies on an estuary in the mid-Atlantic is on Gunston Cove, which is the area that receives the flow from Lake Accotink and Pohick Creek, and then near Fort Belvoir and Pohick Bay Regional Park. That estuary has not filled in. And this sediment load issue has been real since the 1960s. So the reality is that we are not seeing a tremendous impact from sediment from this system in the downstream estuaries. And we don't anticipate that changing. And in fact, we are working diligently to reduce the loads within the stream as part of our Accotink Creek TMDL process. And therefore we would anticipate those loads may reduce over time. All right. There's a question about other dredge projects in Fairfax County and why we suddenly come to one we cannot do. It references Springfield and Annandale. The reality is this lake has been dredged 3 times, once by the U.S. Army, twice by the county. And we do implement dredging on a regular basis in other lakes within the county. But the reality is other lakes were designed as stormwater facilities, and they were sized for the watershed in which they occur. And therefore they're efficient. I'll give you an example. When we dredged Huntsman Lake, Huntsman had been in place for 38 years. And when we dredged it, it was not anywhere near full. And that's because it was designed and sized for a much smaller watershed. Lake Accotink was not designed as a stormwater facility. It was poorly sited. It was placed in what was then not well understood as a developing watershed, but it has a massive drainage area, which became a development project essentially, and it is relatively small for the size of that drainage area. So as a result, Lake Accotink is capturing tremendous sediment load that's way beyond proportionately what's happening in other lakes in the county. So it is a very different project, indeed. I described it earlier today to someone. If you tried to dredge this lake, it's a lot like trying to dig a hole at the beach when the waves are coming in. Every time you shovel out a bit of sand, much more is washed back in the hole. And that's because there's never ending load of sediment arriving at the lake itself. There's a question about the condition of the streams coming into the watershed and what is the county doing about that? And the answer is that we have implemented a tremendous number of projects upstream of Lake Accotink. We are in construction in at least 3 projects right now. One's in Danbury Forest, which is very close to the lake. And we have about $50 million in projects currently planned upstream of the lake. So the answer is the county is working very hard to address the tributaries and even the main stem of Accotink Creek above the lake, which we are required to do under our total maximum daily load for Accotink Creek, and which we are again working diligently with our communities to address.
Hey, Charles, I want to remind people who are on the meeting that they can call in as well. So far you've talking from the chat, but you can call in. It's 855-925-2801 and enter the code 8809. When you hear the recorded messages, press star for more options and press 3 and it'll get you into the queue.
There is a question about why maintenance was not addressed earlier, given the age of this lake. So the lake is indeed over 80 years old, or about 80 years old at this point. I think the answer is that, you know, with management of a facility, the Army again dredged it in 1960s, turned it over to the county dredged it twice. And in both cases, it was really an attempt to try to keep up with the sediment load coming in, but you are correct. At the time, it was a maintenance dredging program was not implemented. But I will say that given that what we know now, the outcome would likely be the same. If a maintenance dredging program had been implemented, they would find that you would have to dredge it frequently, and those costs would continue to rise over time. So although it was not been implemented previously, I think that what we've discovered is that managing this lake is an extremely difficult and expensive proposition. And that, again, as a staff, we don't feel it's sustainable, nor is it environmentally necessarily the best option, because managing for wetlands would actually create still a good water quality benefit. And we can redirect those funds to other projects, which would have a more direct benefit overall on the watershed.
It looks like we do have some people who are calling in and they're waiting. If you have called in, try pressing 3 to get into the queue so you can be recognized.
While that's going on, I see one that's questioning the value of Lake Accotink to lower income families. And I would say we absolutely understand this. We understand the value of this site. And I believe that in our recommendation with our partner, the Park Authority, and also talking to Supervisor Walkinshaw and others, that we see the critical importance of planning the continued benefits for this park going forward with all the community members and its value for many of these lower income families. So absolutely, the county sees that.
Charles, let me clarify. For those who are waiting, press star for more options. Press the star sign and then press 3 to get into the queue.
And Don, do we have anybody who's in the speaker queue?
None so far, sir.
Great. There's a question about whether the county's looked into more collection projects upstream to alleviate the runoff. And the answer is that we have no control over the uplands. We do work whenever possible at improving detention of stormwater, but because this developed, most of this watershed developed before current stormwater standards, detention was not required in many cases, or the detention that's present is of an older style of detention, so it's not necessarily as effective. But the answer is yes, we will continue to work whenever possible to increase detention, and as will the regulatory body, the County Land Development Services, as redevelopment occurs. The question about whether or not we'll publish the study. So the answer is that yes, we've posted many documents on the webpage. The presentations from tonight will be posted by the end of the week, and so you'll be able to see those. If you have other questions, you can always contact me, and we will do everything we can to provide all documents that we have. So the answer is yes, we'll make available to the public the analysis that has occurred. There's a question about getting state funds. There was another question about bond funding. I think the answer is that the state is typically, we have looked at the state loans, but there typically are not many grant funds available for a dredging project. We certainly would exploit that option if this project was going forward, or if this project is going forward. But at this point in time, there are not many grant funding opportunities for dredging projects. Also, bonds are not something we would typically do. The county would likely seek a which we have done. We've gotten approval for low interest loans that we could pay back over a longer period of time, that would provide the greatest possible benefit if we were to go forward with this project.
Okay, Charles, we do have someone who is waiting in the queue.
Excellent. Go ahead, Sharon.
They're going to let them in.
It is last four digits is 2443.
I'm not hearing anything.
Hi, I'm just wondering about Fairfax City, considering how much hardscape area they have and contribution to sediment and stormwater runoff, why they haven't been, or if they have been, talked with in terms of contributing to this project, and if they haven't, why not?
That's a great question. The answer, I went back through the Accotink Creek TMDL today. The Accotink Creek TMDL is divided into three portions of the watershed: Upper Accotink above the lake, Long Branch Central, and the Accotink below the lake. The city of Fairfax, the town of Vienna, and Northern Virginia Community College all were tasked with lowering the sediment load within Accotink Creek as part of that TMDL. So they are contributing. They all have published what they call TMDL action plans that were approved by the state, and they all are trying to implement those plans to reduce sediment loads. So they are making contributions, and they are working to meet their regulatory requirements.
Okay, it looks like we have someone else waiting in the queue. Can we let them in, please?
I just let them in, Sharon. Last four is 3193. Caller 3193, you're on.
Yes. Yes, hello. I'm a reporter with Fairfax Times. I have a few questions.
Yes.
So, first up, what effect could this buildup of sediment ultimately have on Lake Accotink Park?
What we anticipate is that it's slowly over time. We can't predict exactly when it would occur, that the lake would again accumulate more sediment, and we anticipate vegetation becoming established and likely more wetlands to occur over time. But we also anticipate that for the foreseeable future, it won't change much, that we will likely see an open water feature, and that will slowly acquire additional wetlands. So that's, I think visually, the public won't see much of a difference for the near future.
And when might the public start to see a difference?
Again, we can't predict that. A lot of that's dependent upon weather. So for instance, if you get a large storm event, you can either have high deposition, or you can actually have it pull sediment out of the lake. large throughput can actually remove sediment. So I think the answer is that we can't predict exactly how that will occur, but I think it would be a slow accretion, likely the upper end of the lake, and the margins would acquire sediment that would get vegetation, and that might then slowly work towards the middle.
All right. Is there anything that could be done to mitigate the sediment flowing into the lake?
Yes, we are doing that. So we're working hard to restore stream channels upstream of Lake Accotink, and those projects are going forward. And as we mentioned before, the other person asked what other localities are doing. So the city of Fairfax is implementing projects, town of Vienna, and actually Northern Virginia Community College and the Virginia Department of Transportation is also tasked with trying to mitigate some of their flows. So I think there is a concerted effort. It will take time, but there are many people working on reducing the sediment load.
What ultimately led to the recommendation not to dredge?
It's what we presented tonight, that staff feel that going forward with a dredge is not sustainable, that it's simply the cost benefit is a high cost for a relatively low benefit. It's an extremely high impact from a fiscal perspective, an environmental perspective, and a social perspective. And there are many other priorities within the county, and that the overall contribution to water quality is not extremely high when you look at the cost associated with it.
All right. And when will the Board of Supervisors make a decision on this issue?
Supervisor Walkinshaw, would you like to step in on that?
Sure. As I said, it's my intention to take this back to the board in the spring after the full public comment period.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Very happy you came tonight.
Happy to be here.
There is a question in the chat about impacts from development and failures of erosion sediment controls from large projects. I would say that we fully appreciate the fact that development processes can have impacts. We work hard with, all county agencies work hard with whoever is in charge of that development. Some of the things cited are transportation projects, which are generally managed by the state. But indeed, there can be impacts from those. I think the ongoing primary sediment load, however, is still from excessive stormwater runoff eroding our streams. And so, yes, there are contributions from development, but we will, and then you guys are correct to continue to watch with great scrutiny what occurs within Accotink watershed in terms of land development, and it's done properly, and that we do take the right precautions to minimize impact. Don, is there anybody else in the queue?
Yes, we have a couple people in the queue, so we're going to let one of them in right now.
Great.
Okay, caller 8688, you're on.
Yes, hi. You made mention that there's not an issue, or hi, I'm Peter. I represent myself. I frequent the lake. You made a mention that sediment downstream into Gunston Cove and subsequently the bay is not an issue. But what happens when we stop trapping the sediment in the lake? Won't that sediment then continue downstream and impact those ecosystems?
So I think that we didn't say it was not an issue. We just said that it has been ongoing for decades, and it has not proven to be a dramatic impact on those downstream systems. Certainly sediment load is occurring. I think the answer is that, again, this has been going on for decades. The fact that the Army had to dredge in the 1960s, so it's been going on for at least 50 years in terms of lake filling and having excessive load of sediment heading downstream. So I do appreciate your comment that there are impacts downstream, but the relative impacts are not so excessive that there has been a noticeable impact in the estuaries down to the Gunston Cove area. I'll give you one ancillary example, is that the U.S. Army had to dredge Dogue Creek. They actually control Dogue Creek where it becomes tidal, and they had to dredge that because it did fill in. But they have not correspondingly had to dredge Accotink Bay, which is a part of Gunston Cove, which they also control. So I think that that's a good comparison within the county of relative impact of sediment load coming downstream.
Let me rephrase the question. So the way I take it, what you're presenting is you're looking at the existing data with the sediment load with the lake in place. And the problem is that the lake is gathering too much sediment. So if we let the lake fill in, that sediment will eventually start to go downstream. So what happens when the sediment that is currently being trapped in the lake that we are trying to dredge makes its way to those downstream ecosystems?
Well, the sediment, a lot of the sediment's already going downstream. And I will say that today we actually had a really good call with the U.S. Geological Survey on sedimentation in floodplains. And there's a new study out that reinforces the empirical data that 82% of sediment is captured within the system. So a 12%, about 18% can be transferred to the receiving estuaries, but 82% will be captured within the existing stream system. So I think the answer is that, as I mentioned, it will be captured. It has been going on for many decades. So I think that although we are seeing it as a snapshot in time, the impact over the last 50 years on the receiving system has not been so excessive as to cause it to fill in. So I'm not saying there's not an impact. I'm just saying that the relative impact has not been so large as to cause severe degradation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but again, it's the way I take what you're saying is it's not been so large to date, so it's not a problem. And were you saying that, what was it, 82% of it is being captured currently, like in the lake and north of the lake in the stream system? Is that what you're saying?
82% is captured in the floodplain of the stream. So this data, there was a study in Fairfax, a difficult run by the U.S. Geological Survey, and there's a recently released study by the U.S. Geological Survey for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, which reinforces this data. The stream system itself captures the sediment, so it flushes out into the floodplains. And by the way, I just reinforce, I'm not saying it's not an issue. I'm just saying that the relative impact is relatively low, and the cost for implementing a dredge program does not justify the offset, in our opinion, of what it would provide in terms of any benefit.
I assume that survey will be referenced somewhere in the meeting notes. Is that correct?
We had not intended to. If you would be, I'd be happy to email us. If you don't mind, please email me. I'll send you a link to the recent study by the U.S. Geological Survey. I'll also try to find a link to the difficult run survey, which reinforced the larger data, which showed the capture rate for floodplains within the stream systems.
Okay, we're going to have to move on as this
Sounds
call.
good.
Yeah, has exceeded 3 minutes. I would like to recognize Delegate Vivian Watts, who has joined the meeting at this point, and we're going to go to another caller that'll be let in shortly.
Thank you, Sharon. Caller 2443, you're in.
I was just wondering what the impacts would be to the dam, and if that would need to be remediated in the future to account for the lake filling in and, you know, additional sediment up against it and all that.
That's a great question. I think there are two answers to that. One is that the analysis that was done on the dam back in, I believe, 2018 or 19, we did do a pretty thorough study of the dam with a qualified engineer. He said the dam is in pretty good shape. It will require maintenance over time, and that at this point in time, no major maintenance was anticipated. However, we recently talked to the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. They reminded us that to operate the dam in a continued manner will require periodic inspections by a qualified engineer, and that engineer may make recommendations that says we need to do different types of activity along the dam. So I think the answer is that we don't foresee major costs in the short term, but that we would anticipate routine costs in the long term to maintain the dam. So I think the dam could be sustainable, but we would have to rely on the reports of experts that do the analysis and tell us what we need to maintain them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And if the if the lake fills in, would there be a need to keep the dam, or would it be, more beneficial or efficient to remove the dam to allow, better water flow through the stream system to the bay?
That's a great question. We can't answer it tonight. I think the answer is that
Okay.
we have to address that as part of additional future analysis.
Okay.
I want to float one of the chat questions up to Amanda or Mike. Why are sediments that are being excavated from, or maybe dredged from the lake, not be reusable if we were to use it for instance, a smaller offline lake berm?
I can take that. So based on the investigation that we did, a lot of the material that is within the lake is more of a silty type material that isn't conducive for construction of the berm. As I think has been mentioned, that new dam, there are certain regulatory requirements that need to be made to ensure that is safe and that is able to hold back the water of that smaller offline lake. So that's really the reason for it. Is there might be a small portion of material that's more like of the sandy, gravelly type nature, but a lot of the silt material would not be able to be incorporated.
There are multiple questions about the 43% increase in potential dredged material for the base dredge. I think the answer, we kind of mentioned it before. Number one, when Arcadis conducted the follow-up bathymetric survey, they discovered that 50,000 additional cubic yards have been captured. But we also took into account in discussion with Arcadis that while you're dredging, sediment continues to arrive, and it's a 3-year dredge. And as I mentioned before, just like digging a hole at the beach while the waves are coming in, as you're shoveling sand out, the water's washing sand back in. So we would have to over dredge essentially in order to keep up with the depth, our target depth. There was another question about the target depth. Why 8 feet? What's the magic number about that? And the answer is that we looked at that as a sustainable number. So if you look at it from a usability perspective, this project was envisioned primarily as a recreational and aesthetic amenity project. And in order to keep the lake usable and functional, and for that purposes, we thought 8 feet would give us a buffer that would also allow us to come back and do the maintenance dredging at intervals to keep a relative quality to that facility. So that's the reason why 8 feet was chosen.
Charles, there was an important question in the chat that it might be helpful for us to address. If the lake were to continue filling in, would that cause any flooding problems upstream?
Elevation based on the control structure. So it doesn't, filling the lake in doesn't matter if it's more sediment and less water, but the bottom line is the surface elevation will not exceed that which is there now. And so it would not affect flooding.
Okay, we have someone who is waiting on the phone. If we could let that caller in, please.
Thank you, Sharon. Caller 0914, you're in.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my call. My name is Allison Shore. I'm calling in for myself. You had mentioned earlier that the lake is currently flooding specific areas. I'd like to know what those areas are and how many homes specifically it's flooding and the frequency.
You want to take that, Chris?
Yes, I apologize if I was unclear. The lake is not flooding homes today. I was talking about in lieu of spending the money that would be necessary to do the full lake dredging, that there's a limit. It's a zero-sum game in terms of that amount of money. So if we spend money on Lake Accotink project, that means we're not spending that equivalent amount of money somewhere else in the county. We know that there are flooding problems at different locations in the county. And so the lake is not flooding homes. I was saying that as an alternative to dredging the lake, that money could, instead of the county paying to dredge the lake, that funding could be used to address flood risk reduction for those homes. So I apologize if I was unclear on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that clarification.
Excellent. I'm sorry about that. I'd like to respond to a 2-part question in the chat. One is about whether or not the county would sell wetland credits if wetlands are created. The answer is no. If wetlands occur in that lake footprint, the intent would be to manage them for the environmental benefit and for the benefit of the public. The other question is, why was maintenance not considered in the original estimate when we came up with $30 million? I think the answer is that that was not the question at the time. The question at the time was, what are the management options, and what would potentially cost to implement them? And the question was, what would it cost to implement a base dredge? It did not ask the question about maintenance. So as we were given the project to proceed with, we understood the criticality of including a maintenance program. And so that's what we incorporated into our considerations in this process. So it was not a failure by anybody in the past. It simply was not a question that was asked as part of the alternatives analysis process, which was the previous process.
If there is anyone who is waiting in to speak, make sure that you push *3 to get into the queue. *3.
There's a question about protecting the last remaining mussel populations in the creek. And we do not have a plan to address it at this time. For those of you who are not aware, there was a survey conducted in 2015 by, it was sponsored by the Friends of Accotink Creek, and involved a lot of folks, and they assessed the remaining mussel population below the lake. And we do not fully understand the conditions that cause that area to sustain mussels, and there is great concern that additional sediment load could affect those mussels. And the answer is we don't know what the effect will be and during what timing that would occur. So that would be something that have to be addressed with additional analysis.
We do have a caller waiting in the queue. If we could let that person in, please.
Yes, caller 3774, you're in.
Crestwood area, like the entranceway to the park and all, and appreciate you all having this. Two-part question. One, as the lake sediment or the level begins to rise with sediment buildup, what's the effect on the habitat, fish, mussels? Could we expect like a dead lake scenario with chemicals in the sediment and so forth, algae?
I'll let you know that we engaged with the state fisheries biologists from the Department of Wildlife Resources several years ago. They've been looking at this lake for years, and the lake has not been a functional fishery for decades. It essentially is very poor water quality, and they stated that it's a poor fishery. So from a fishery perspective, it's not very functional now. What we'd anticipate is as wetlands begin to increase, we would actually improve wildlife habitat, because the diversity of the habitat would support a far larger suite of species. And as the biomass increased, it would increase the biomass of wildlife. So I think the key is that it would actually improve as a wetland over the current condition. And that current condition is a condition that's existed for decades.
Interesting. Thank you for that. My second quick question is the dam. Somebody had mentioned the dam. And is there anything that we can do to improve the functionality of the dam? Maintenance is one thing, but is there something that can be done to that dam to help alleviate any issues going forward, and planning on that?
Is there a specific concern that you have about the dam?
No, it just seems to be like a key choke point. And what's the effect of that choke point? Is there something that can be done as a remediation that's a lower cost than this huge project, but can have a significant, or at least a meaningful impact for cost value?
I will defer to one of the engineers on the call here in our group. However, I'll state that our understanding is that dam's pretty sound, and it's a pretty simple design. So as dams go, I think it's doing pretty well. Would somebody like to chime in from maybe Mike or Amanda, or if you haven't looked at it, maybe Paul?
Well, I would just say, I would point out, Charles, that I think you addressed this in a way in one of your previous responses. I think if you look at, potential evolution of the asset, you'd have to look at whether or not maintaining it in its present state or doing a partial removal to facilitate, better use of or better flow through would be your answer, right? So I think number one, you've stated it's in sound condition. Number two would be an evaluation of what's best to do with the dam to best serve the function that is decided to move forward with for the park in general.
Does that answer your question?
That would seem, yeah, and that would seem like a good engineering project to do with this issue we're having, so that it's a nice choice for the County Board of Supervisors and the residents to have as an option. And looking forward, having that in your folders ready to go is a good, smart move. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you all having this.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your call and questions. I want to ask the Park Authority to respond to one of the questions in the chat. It's the summary of the question is, if the lake were to convert to a wetlands, how would that impact the surrounding park facilities? And would those facilities remain or would they be removed?
So this is Jay Cole, I'm the Executive Director of the Park Authority. That's all part of the master plan. When we're talking about, maybe it gets bigger, maybe it gets smaller, I think figuring out what amenities can fit, into it and how we capitalize on the new amenity that would be where the lake is right now is all up for conversation. Is there going to be a trail that goes all the way around it? Are we talking about a boardwalk? I mean, I think that's really up to working with the community to see what it is that they really value about the surrounding areas.
Great. There's a question about whether or not the lake filling up would affect properties downstream. And our answer at this point is, in the current condition with the dam in place, the answer would be no, that what's going on now would go on in the foreseeable future. So there should be no increased impact to downstream properties. And if there were a change to the dam configuration in the future, that would have to be addressed within the scope of the project. But we certainly would be required to not have an impact to downstream properties. So that would be part of the consideration for actions taken.
And Charles, we have a few people waiting in the queue.
All right, let's go.
So we are going to let one in very shortly.
Thank you, Sharon. Caller 8046, you're in.
Concern, so I appreciate that. I'm Kathy Field, and I'm bringing, kind of just some questions from the North Springfield community, so representing the North Springfield Civic Association. Charles, there was one question in my comment of questions that I think you may have missed, and so I wanted to follow up by phone on this, and this is a question coming from the community. Regarding the estimate for the maintenance dredge activities that Amanda presented, did those numbers, does that cost already take into account all of the benefits that we should be seeing from upstream restoration? With all these projects, we would hope that the amount of sediment flowing into the lake is certainly lessened by those projects and would require smaller dredges or less effort going forward.
I'll take that real quickly. I think the answer is that we did not anticipate an appreciable reduction in the near term. And I will state that as you empty the lake, it becomes more efficient at capturing sediment. So it was estimated in 2016, 17 or so that that about 46,000 cubic yards of materials arriving at the lake annually. As Amanda shared earlier, something a little less than 20,000 is being captured by the lake currently. As you empty the lake, it becomes more efficient at capturing that sediment. So even if you reduce the load coming to the lake, it captures the same fraction of what's coming. So the amount of sediment being captured will increase as the lake empties. And if in its current state, even if you reduce the load to it, it'll still be capturing a fraction of that load. So I don't think there's a horizon on which we reduce the sediment flow to the lake significantly enough to prevent it from filling. So I think that's the only answer at this point we can provide, but we did not include a kind of a drawdown in the load arriving at the lake in the analysis about the maintenance dredging.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
That's it for me. Thanks.
Absolutely, Kathy. Thank you very much. There is a couple questions in the chat. There's one from the Friends of Accotink Creek talking about, should the dredging not occur, what are the concepts being evaluated in terms of stream channel restoration or wetlands? And I think the answer is we have not evaluated those options yet. We would anticipate that we would look at managed wetlands if they occur or some other option, but that would have to proceed under the auspices of both the master planning process and looking at how we would manage the facility over time. There is a question about why it was so much cheaper to dredge in the past without building pipelines and dewatering facilities. And I think the answer is we don't know what they did in the 1960s. We can tell you for a fact, though, the county dredged twice, in the 1980s and in 2008. In both those instances, they did use pipelines, but we were able to essentially dump the material into local areas. So in one instance, it was dumped into small catchments above the old railroad embankment, which is now the trail around the lake, the 1850s railroad embankment. And in 2008, there was a deal with Vulcan Materials Company off of Edsel Road to dump the material in an old settling area. We looked at those options. There are no local options to essentially waste the material, and the quantities we're looking at are far significant in terms of being higher volumes to the old ones. So we did not have a local opportunity to waste the material at a low or a free cost, if that's helpful.
Charles, if we could move back over to the phones for a minute. We have two
Absolutely.
people in the queue. Please let one of them in.
Thank you, Sharon. Caller 9087, you're in.
Meeting tonight. I'm so grateful to the work that you all are doing. My name is Lisa Myers, and I have to confess that I'm someone that has clocked a little more than 5,000 miles traipsing through the woods around the lake over the last who knows how many years.
Wow.
And I'm concerned. I have
That's
the
great.
privilege of serving Wildlife Rescue League, and although you've talked about fish a little bit and birds a little bit, we have a very complex wildlife ecosystem around the lake. And my question is, to what extent have you tapped into the very strong wildlife expertise in Virginia through the Wildlife Rescue League or others? And is there anything I can do to help connect you to voices who might, I don't know what their answer would be, but who might have some input that would help us protect the wildlife while you move in whatever direction you move in. And thanks to all of you. I know it's late, and thanks for being here and doing this, but please save my lake.
And then quick question. Thank you very much for calling, and clearly you're a very vested member of the community in terms of your participation at Lake Accotink. What is your specific concern with the wildlife in the near term?
I'm sorry, the question is that the demise of the lake or the dredging of the lake, the reconfiguring of the physical characteristics of that area are going to have a profound impact on the wildlife community, from possums and raccoons and foxes and the deer. Full disclosure, I'm a rabid opponent of the deer hunting in the parks, but it's going to have a significant impact on the wildlife there. And all I'm asking is, have you considered, and who have you considered, and who have you consulted on the impact of the potential wildlife up and down the stream and around the lake? And if the answer is you're not sure, please reach out to me and let me connect you to folks who know a lot more about it than I do.
Well, thank you very much. I think the several answers. Number one, I'm also an ecologist, and I will say that we don't have a plan yet. As we stated, if wetlands do establish themselves, the wildlife habitat will actually improve in the lake over the current condition. So the habitat would be improved. We have talked extensively with fisheries biologists, and one of the considerations was whatever happens to management of the lake in the future, can we improve fish passage, for instance, over the lake? We also had comments from a local birder who's watched the lake for decades, and he's spoken about the need to maintain, for instance, mudflats for wading birds. So there has been discussions. I will also say the Park Authority has a fantastic natural resources management branch that we have engaged with heavily. We would work very closely with the natural resource management branch, and if this switches to a different project, the Park Authority have the lead in discussing how to manage the park. But certainly wildlife would be a prime consideration, and how to manage those resources would also be in the fore of what we would do.
Thank you so much for that very, very fine response. And if I can be of assistance, put me in the game, Coach. I want to help.
Yes, ma'am. I want to address some comments real quick in the chat. One is about property values around the lake if the lake goes down. I don't have a perfect answer for you. I will say, however, there's a recent study about stream restoration in the Baltimore region, and they found that property values went up. So if you have managed resources in an area, and I would probably look to Huntley Meadows as a local example, but if you have managed resources that have a high wildlife value and public investment, I do not see property values diminishing. In fact, they may increase depending upon how it's managed. There's a question about whether if the lake were full, would the creek level rise downstream? The answer is no. The water would flow over the dam as it is now, and the elevation of that above within the lake impoundment would remain the same.
Charles, let's take a moment to let Supervisor Gross say a few words.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. And to Supervisor Walkinshaw, thank you for setting up this excellent meeting.
Looks like she's having some technical issues.
It might be better if she cut off her webcam so that it saves bandwidth. So just audio.
Supervisor Gross, can you hear me?
We thought we had a decent to do.
Are you
yes,
able?
I can.
Are you able to turn off your webcam? We're having some technical difficulties, and we can't hear you very well. If you can turn off your webcam, that may help.
Let me turn off the camera and just make the comments. Anyway, I wanted to say that it like everyone else, I've been shocked by the cost estimates, but we know that a lot of things have changed as we dig deeper, and no pun intended, to actually figure out what is the best way. I joined Supervisor Walkinshaw in being concerned about it, and the staff is concerned. But the public process is one that I think is going to be well used in this particular instance. And I look forward to hearing more of the commentary as we move forward to, I guess it's April as the deadline for the public comments. So thank you very much for allowing me to participate. I do a lot of work on restoring Chesapeake Bay. And so I'm especially interested in that particular situation. And I want to thank again, Charles, for your very clear and concise answers. We'll see what happens as we move through this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Gross. I will say there's a question in the chat about whether or not I'm connected to the Charles Smith developer group. No, I'm not. Unrelated, I have a common name. So there you go. But thanks for the question.
There's a question about why we're ending the public comment period on April 1st.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that, Chris. Like I said, it's my hope to go to the Board of Supervisors with this in the spring. So I wanted to make sure we provided enough time to catalog and summarize the feedback that we get from the community so the board fully understands it. If we get close to April 1st and it seems that there's a need to extend that, we can take a look at that at that time. And if there's real interest in the community in extending it beyond April 1st, we can, just with the understanding that that could prolong the process. So I think we'll shoot for April 1st, but we'll keep an open mind as we move closer.
Thank you. So
There are
we have.
I'm sorry, there's a couple
Go
of
ahead.
questions about corporate interests. There are no corporate interests involved in this. This is a county project. So I'll put that to bed right now.
Okay, we do have someone waiting in the queue. If you could let them in, please.
Thank you, Sharon. Caller 6902, you're in.
I'm sorry, there's a couple of questions about corporate interests. There are no corporate interests involved in this. This is a county project. So I'll put that to bed right now.
Caller 6902, if you could mute your laptop, please. That'd be great.
Yes, this is Gail Middle. Can you hear me?
Hi, Gail. Yes, we can.
Yes, I live in Crestwood, which is right across the street from Lake Accotink. We enjoy it. I'm just wondering, I'm glad to see Vivian Watts here tonight. She's been a longtime friend of our neighborhood. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Supervisor Walkinshaw. I'm just wondering, are the other elected officials whose constituents enjoy the lake included in the discussions about the lake? I know that when we first had public meetings, we had Supervisor Harity, Supervisor Cook, and then Supervisor McKay. So that's one question. Are the other supervisors who border that lake being included in these discussions? And then I had another question. If the money was not an issue, would that really change anything? I had to wonder when I talked to Charles this summer about the cost, and there were so many unknowns, or at least nobody was talking about them, and now we are talking about them. If the cost had been known this summer, why did we continue to spin our wheels trying to block Southern Drive? I mean, that was under heavy consideration, even though we had trucks coming and going already in our neighborhood. Why wasn't that cost factor a means of just stopping the discussion right then and saying, hey, it's too much? And then why are we always talking about 25 years and the total cost? Why not in smaller increments? Why not 17 million a year or 16 million a year? And why do we have to project out that far? I don't understand. If we can't get it right, if we didn't get it right this time, how can we trust that it's going to be right 25 years out? What's to say there aren't going to be more developments that would help the dredging or help whatever? So those are my questions. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your answers.
And Gail, thank you very much. Supervisor Walkinshaw, in terms of inclusion of elected officials?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Gail. It's good to hear from you. The answer is yes. Other elected officials had the opportunity to participate in this meeting and other meetings, and will certainly be part of the dialogue and the decision-making process. Obviously, in terms of other board members, folks have a lot of commitments, and I'm sure Supervisor Lusk especially will be reviewing the video of this meeting and getting a full briefing on it, so he'll know as much about it as I do, even though he couldn't make it himself in person tonight. And I'll leave the other question to others unless there's something I can add.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Supervisor Walkinshaw. And Gail, I think a couple comments. One is that last summer we did share that we had gone back to the Board of Supervisors and they approved a second loan amount. So at that point, the base dredge number was raised to $60 million. And we were continuing our analysis. So I think the key is that doing our due diligence, we were proceeding through the process of understanding what it would cost to dredge this lake. So that number was kind of ratcheting up. The second is that we did not feel in good conscience we could proceed without discussing the maintenance, because the maintenance is absolutely critical. And we must consider the upfront cost. And upfront, we must consider the cost of the long-term investment. In the stormwater area, I will tell you that we have a growing um, inventory of facilities. They are very expensive to maintain, and we constantly have to report back to the Board of Supervisors and others on what it takes to maintain them. So the maintenance was a critical piece. I see Delegate Watts has her hand up. Vivian?
I put my hand up in part because I'm aware of the time. First of all, thank you so much for recording this so that those of us who had other absolute responsibilities can have the benefit of listening to this in detail. I'm going to throw out two thoughts that I have in case we either have ongoing dialogue because they have validity, or you can respond at this point. I followed the Chesapeake Bay for a long, long time, and I know we've made progress in point pollution with sewage treatment, et cetera, as well as agricultural runoff, but we've really not made any progress on urban runoff. So my concern is there potential under any of the Chesapeake Bay initiatives to look at the maintenance issue? So much of what's been done with the Chesapeake Bay has been initiating something that hasn't been in place before, but now we're dealing with how do you keep something functioning as it has functioned. Obviously, that silt that is there is not in the bay. To whatever degree it adds to the load, it's not in the bay, including some of the heavy metal issues that might be with it. So that becomes one concern. Has there been any conversation with the Chesapeake Bay initiatives that might help in grants or anything else along this line to address that? That becomes my main concern or main exploring thoughts.
Thank you, Delegate Watts.
So again, if there is, please, I will certainly be exploring it as I have briefly down here, but if there is any tie-in with the county being able to work with the broader initiative of the Chesapeake Bay, then one final thought, we had a lot of concern about 6-8 years, maybe 10 years ago, about EPA looking at velocity of runoff. And certainly velocity is very much a driving force in siltation. So that as we look at some of the climate change issues and the strength of storms that we are experiencing, I also want to put that out on the table of whether there's any initiative of some of the funding that may be addressing climate change issues, that this might be something that could also be explored.
That's a very broad question, and I appreciate that. We certainly are considering that within Fairfax County. I will say that within this watershed, we're doing all we can within working with our urban forestry division at tree cover. We're doing all we can with partnerships and working with others to mitigate runoff wherever we can. I will say too that within this watershed, we are planning the Long Branch Central Watershed Management Area project, which is to address the local TMDL within Long Branch. And the specific goal of that project is not only to meet the TMDL, but also to attenuate flows and through floodplain storage and other methods of slowing water down. And I would say that Fairfax, quite honestly, and I'm just not tooting our own horn, but we are only aware of one other jurisdiction in the Mid-Atlantic who's actually taken as broad of an approach at looking at a watershed management area and trying to address those issues. So yes, and I do appreciate what you stated, that it's a very large issue, but we are certainly trying as we can to tackle it. I will say that in this specific context, Lake Accotink does not slow down flows. It is a full pool lake, so it does very little to attenuate flow. It essentially passes through. So whether it has sediment in it or whether it's just it has a deeper pool doesn't really matter, because the lake sits at full pool, a storm flush goes through. So in this instance, it won't appreciably address any flow issues in terms of how we manage that full pool lake. If that's helpful.
And you also, so you also don't assume that velocity upstream would add in any way to what we're trying to deal with Accotink?
Well, velocities do have a direct impact on the sediment load. So it's the total discharge as well as velocity, so the Q. And in that instance, the amount of water running through that system and the velocities associated with that flow are directly impacting the sediment load. And we are trying to address that wherever we can. So we certainly are, but the management of the lake itself won't impact that because we are continuing to address the upstream areas wherever we can. But the lake itself does not appreciably affect the downstream portion from the lake. And I think that's the context in which we most appropriately have to consider it. If that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Charles, I did receive an email from someone who said, my only question now is when did staff start to realize the overall cost would skyrocket?
Well, I mentioned that last year we came back to the board and we asked for permission to request an additional loan. That occurred in June of 2022. And it was that time frame we were seeing the cost increases, but it was later that year that they really began to see the higher costs. So it's later last year we began to see those, and we also initiated, as Chris mentioned, to do our due diligence, the smaller offline lake study to understand if there were an alternative that could provide many of the same benefits of a larger lake, but potentially at a lower cost. And so, yeah, that's the time frame in which we begin to see those costs go up significantly.
Charles, on that question, maybe you could just describe in a little bit of detail one of the elements of that cost, namely the disposal costs, and when that kind of came into view and what that would look like in terms of the quarry.
Certainly. I think what we realized in working with Arcadis, we were exploring how we could, are there options to dispose of this at a low cost? That was some of the original assumptions, thought that maybe we could waste some of that material within existing county land, within power line easements that were not in floodplains, within the existing parkland, or whether or not there would be a low cost alternative. And the quantities we're dealing with are significant. And the answer is that we did not feel that was available. So Arcadis did an excellent job of looking at a wide range of potential options to dispose of that material. The lowest cost option we came up with is a local quarry that is permitted to receive fill. And they are, it's actually located in Centerville. It's the Luckstone Quarry off of Route 29. And they are taking a tremendous quantity of fill right now. And they can give us a flat rate. This is what it would cost to actually dispose of fill here. So in looking at those many options, the most affordable was local quarry disposal. And so we were able to get concrete numbers, and Arcadis worked hard to look at the trucking costs to come up with that. But the result was, I believe, Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it came to around $34 million just to haul off and dispose of the material, looking at those scenarios with very well-known costs based on current trucking and the actual rates from the quarry. Is that correct, Amanda?
Yep, that's correct.
I think that's important because folks are understandably wondering, why did it take so long to get to this cost estimate? And one of the answers is there was a desperate search for a disposal site. And the identification of this particular disposal site and the costing of that disposal site took some time. And it's not an ideal site, but it's the site that's available.
Absolutely. We discussed whether or not rail was available, and we just determined it is not. Arcadis looked into whether or not it could be transported by various means, including barge, and removed to areas further south in Virginia. And then there's the holy grail of finding a place that wants your fill, that really needs it badly. And those, with the 500,000 cubic yards we're anticipating, that was not available. The other thing we looked at was beneficial reuse, and we had very, very good conversations with some companies that do. They're able to use mechanical means to separate the pieces of the sediment, and they stated flat out that our quantities were too large to process it in an efficient manner to actually reusing that material. So the answer is that I think we did a pretty exhaustive search and that we determined that we would have to pay to dispose of the material locally, and that was our cheapest option.
Charles, there's a question that's been asked a couple of times in the chat about how we as county staff are assessing the value of the lake to the community, and even whether or not, we live within the community. I attempted to do that in my opening remarks. We clearly recognize that the community places a high value on Lake Accotink and the park. Our analysis, my recommendation, is based on engineering, ecological, and fiscal analysis, right? And so part of the purpose of this process is for you to share your perspectives on the value of the lake in whatever form you would like to see it in the future with the Board of Supervisors, so they can factor that in into their decision making. At the cost that we're talking about, though, these costs will have to be borne by all of the residents of Fairfax County, right? So we would have to raise taxes for all residents. And I think that's part of the analysis too. So I don't want you to feel that we are not valuing the lake. I recognize that. We're recommending based on our technical analysis. That's what's forming our recommendation to the board.
There's a question about whether or not if the lake were to convert to wetlands, if that would cause mosquito problems. So from a pest perspective, the answer is I do not believe so. So again, I'll use Huntley as our in-county example. Huntley has been a very high functioning wetland for many decades, and there are no appreciable mosquito issues. So that's because there are fish within the wetland that provide, they are predators for mosquito larvae.
We don't have a lot of time left on the meeting, less than 15 minutes. If there is anyone on the phone waiting, please press *3 so you can be placed into the queue and your questions can be answered. Same for anyone who has anything that they would like to put in the chat. Do so now so we can get to them before the meeting wraps up.
There's a question about, have you costed the efforts to ameliorate the potential health, environmental risks to the surrounding community from accumulating silt? We do not anticipate any health issues from accumulating silt. There were TMDLs issued for the area for PCBs and mercury. Those were based on fish tissue samples. However, the sampling that has been done to date has not revealed, and Arcadis did extensive sampling of the sediment within the lake, did not reveal high levels of toxins. They were below EPA levels. So we do not believe that the accumulating sediment causes a human health risk.
Charles, I'll help you process some of the comments that I know we're all trying to read through. There's been a couple comments about what is the county doing in terms of maybe levying a fine or attempting to regulate state VDOT in particular projects because of their impact. Just wanted to remind everyone the county doesn't have authority over state VDOT projects. There was, there was another. I think you addressed this one, Charles. If you did, please remind me. But would we be able to dredge to a lower depth to lower the cost of the project? Would that be a feasible solution?
So the answer, I think, is largely no, because again, you increase time and cost with a longer dredge. So it's a kind of a direct cost per quantity, and as you're doing it, you're also accumulating sediment. So I think in talking with Arcadis staff, we determined that we're trying to keep this to an appreciable window, but it does not pay for us to dredge longer and deeper, because this lake will accumulate sediment more rapidly as you create more capacity. So basically it'll balance out in the long run. It kind of is what it is. So we reached the conclusion that hitting that target depth of 8 feet in roughly 3 years and redredging every 5 years is what is probably the most efficient dredge cycle for this system, given all the parameters.
Charles, would you like to address again the question about why the use of the rail infrastructure was found to be not feasible?
Absolutely. So in our analysis and talking about rail, there's a lot of factors involved. One is a rail siding. You have to have a siding to load. Two is the fact that rail cars haul products. They don't haul slop, essentially. So the sediment comes out, you'd have to process the sediment, and you'd be loading essentially an unusable material, a waste material, onto rail cars, which are very valuable. So if you do that, then where do you take it? So these are specialized cars that are kind of hard to come by. They usually haul things like sand, coal, gravel. They're finished products that are being transported someplace to be used. So if you're hauling instead a waste product, where do you take it? So we looked at the availability of rail sidings, the availability of the types of cars we would need, and then where would you have to take it to offload it? And the answer is we couldn't find a location within states, a number of states away, that could actually take this material where they could dump it. And then they would have to haul. Then at the other end, they would have to do something with it. So the answer is it became exponentially problematic to try to load it in a rail car, just because they're not set up to take waste material and then dump it someplace and haul it away from there. Instead, the only way to really make rail efficient is if you could process the sediment to remove, for instance, usable fractions like sand and take it someplace. But the answer we got from the processors was we have too much. There's simply too much material to process efficiently and then reuse that material. So it became apparent that rail was not an option for us. We had to look at local trucking. Are there other questions that are outstanding? I think we covered a wide spectrum of the ones that were there. Anybody seen any question outstanding?
Charles, I don't think we've touched on this one. Have we given any consideration to actually expanding the lake? In other words, building a new dam further downstream?
So I think the answer, when we looked at the alternatives analysis previously, this dam is sited within a pretty large stream valley, a very large drainage area. We looked at pre-treatment options, but we did not look at establishing a new dam. Essentially, I don't think the valley narrows as you go down from Lake Accotink. It's essentially, there's not really an opportunity to expand that. And if you did expand it, what does that really mean? Because it's not sized for the system. So an expanded lake would essentially capture a whole lot more sediment, which would become a new problem in terms of management. So I believe the answer would be there's not really an opportunity within this watershed to expand the footprint of the lake.
Charles, I'm wondering if I don't think this question has come up tonight, but I have heard it from folks over the course of the last week. Earlier in the process, there was consideration of a forebay or some number of forebays and even a beaver dam concept. I'm wondering if you could just talk through those. What are those and why are those not part of the consideration anymore?
Yes, the beaver dam concept was to put a series of check dams across the stream valley above the lake. And what was determined was they would rapidly fill in within the first year. So essentially any benefit they would provide would be quickly exhausted, and they really would not slow down the rate of sedimentation of the lake. A forebay, the concept of a forebay, we use it all the time. And we actually, in our large lake dredging programs throughout the county, we've installed forebays within, for instance, Huntsman Lake, Royal Lake, and these other large regulatory dams that we have. It's very efficient if you have a watershed that's appropriately sized to the basin. But with Accotink, the problem is it's a very small water body given the 30 square miles of drainage and the amount of erosion. So what we determined is you couldn't put in a forebay that would have provided an appreciable benefit. And the reality is, so basically, if you picture it, the forebay would fill very rapidly. And so much sediment's coming into the system that not only would the forebay fill, but it would continue to fill the lake on the other side of the forebay. So as a result, we'd have to dredge the forebay every couple of years as a minimum, and still have to dredge the lake at a similar interval. So there was not considered to be a real benefit to providing a forebay because, again, the size of the system is so large, the amount of sediment is so large that a forebay would not be efficient at Lake Accotink.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left in the meeting.
Are there any comments we have not addressed that I think we've addressed a wide spectrum?
I see, Charles, there are a couple of questions that have just come in there on the chat in the last few minutes. Are you able to see those?
Yes. Question about primary hazardous materials in the silt. Amanda, I don't believe there was much. Shannon's also on the call, but would one of you like to address the issues of the composition of the silt?
Sure, I can do that. So as part of the investigation that we did as part of this project, we took a number of sediment cores throughout the lake. We did have those analyzed, and I believe there was one sample that had, I believe it's associated with gas and diesel fuel, and it was not to the point that it would be considered hazardous or require remediation just from the point of contamination and needing to do a remediation style project. So for the most part, the main concern with the sediment that we have as far as the reuse potential is more just, again, from the physical properties of it being that really silty, mucky type material, and it's not from a chemical consideration of being hazardous.
Great. There's another question about trying to ask us to forecast when a lake might fill in and when a sediment wetlands might occur. And I appreciate the question very much. And the answer is we can't give a really good response because we don't know. I think our gut is that for the foreseeable future, it will remain an open water feature. It will look essentially like it does. But over time, it will accumulate wetlands along the margins at the upper end of the lake. And I hope that helps. But again, we can't guarantee. And that could change based on weather patterns. It really could. If you had high drought or higher flow, you could accumulate sediment or you could reduce water levels. So that could really influence it. The issue of reusing the material, again, we talked about this. We can't reuse the material because in order to reuse it, you have to have something that someone determines they can reuse. So we looked at separating the material as is, spreading it on fields or something like that. We haven't found a place where we can do that. One of the best options would be to separate out things like sand, which is highly reusable. But in order to do that, our quantities are so large, they couldn't keep up with being able to do that. So it's not considered to be an efficient process with the quantities we're dealing with.
Okay, everyone, it's 8:58, and what we're going to do right now is we are going to give Supervisor Walkinshaw an opportunity to address our audience for the last couple minutes before we close.
Sure. Thank you, Sharon. And I know we have Chairman McKay here as well, but I just want to thank everyone for participating. Really valuable dialogue and great questions. And as I said in the beginning of this meeting, after our in-person meeting tomorrow night, we'll have a public comment period going through at least April 1st. So you'll have the opportunity to respond to the survey, ask additional questions that will be answered, the most common of which will be answered on the FAQ doc, and make sure that when the Board of Supervisors considers this issue in the spring, they'll have the benefit of the community's full perspective and view. And my commitment to you, especially those that I represent around the lake and around the park, is that I will ensure that your voice is heard and is part of that process as we move forward. So thank you everyone for participating tonight.
We are almost at 9 o'clock in a few seconds, so this concludes our public meeting for tonight.
Sharon, I think we have Chairman McKay here.
Yeah, Sharon,
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Just before we finish, I just want to thank the incredible staff that did an amazing job tonight answering a lot of questions. And, we opened this meeting with how disappointed we were. And I said, this doesn't happen very often in the county. And I think you can see the caliber of staff we have. And so I think all of us are disappointed, but I want to thank the community for weighing in, reading all the chat, hearing the comments that people made, very constructive, good questions, many of the same questions that, we've been asking since we learned about this. Also want to thank Supervisor Gross and Delegate Watts for joining us as well. I know there's another meeting tomorrow. We know that we're going to have an open comment period. And as you acknowledge, this will ultimately come to the board in a committee meeting for further discussion. And certainly when that happens, we'll be broadcasting that date so that folks can follow this through, as the same path that we're on. But really just wanted to close by thanking the community and our staff for what I thought was an excellent meeting.
And Sharon, before we close, quick logistical note for tomorrow night. We really appreciate everybody's turnout tonight and look forward to seeing people tomorrow. If you're not familiar with Kings Glen Elementary School, as you're coming in on Danbury Forest Drive, you'll turn to the first parking lot on the left. It's essentially behind the school. They quote as the back of the school. As you're facing the building, it'll be door number 3. It's very well marked with a big number 3 to the left of the dumpsters. So you can't miss that. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow night.
Okay. It's 9 p.m. Actually, it's 9:01 now. So this concludes our public meeting for tonight. I want to thank you for your interest and your courtesy. Please remember you can send us your comments and ask questions by emailing f515@publicinput.com. I will put that link in the chat for you. And have a good evening. Thank you for participating.
Thank you all very much.